This is the Future of Finance. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Future of Finance. I'm Georges Dyer, and today I speak with David Orr. David is a professor of environmental studies and politics emeritus and was counselor to the president of Oberlin College through 2017. He is now a professor of practice at Arizona State University. He is the author of 8 books, including Dangerous Years, Climate Change, The Long Emergency, and the Way Forward, Democracy Unchained, and Democracy in a Hotter Time. We talk about ideas for new economic systems that have been around for many years, but might finally be ready to have their day in the sun and break into the mainstream. We also talk about the threats to democracy that we're currently facing and what it will take to create better political systems, what he calls Democracy 4.0. We talk about climate change, the role of higher education, and the need for systems thinking. David never shies away from being honest about the existential risks we face from climate change, democratic backsliding, and AI. But he's also intensely optimistic about the opportunities that this great disruption provides to create better systems and better lives for all people and all living things, and the role that investors play in making that happen. David is a big thinker, a longtime leader in this space, and a great storyteller. He mentions tons of great books and other thought leaders in sustainability, and we've captured those in a link in the show notes, so please check those out. And get ready for a great conversation. Let us know what you think, and please follow the show, share it with your friends. And now, here's David. Well, David, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the podcast. Great to see you.
It's good to see you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very excited to hear your thoughts in this time. And I was thinking about so many directions we could take this conversation, given all the work you've done. But I wanted to kind of start with what I see as sort of the core of your work around ecological literacy, and particularly how it relates to two things. The economic system, sort of the traditional economic system, like where it's served us well and where it hasn't, and also the role that education plays in that, and just sort of that tie-in between the educational system preparing us or not preparing us to have that ecological literacy and how that shows up in our economic system. So just a light question to start with there.
All right, we got 4 or 5 hours here.
Yeah.
Well, my introduction to economics was at Wharton. When I was doing a PhD work in the politics department, I was taking courses on the side over at Wharton. And so my introduction was pretty standard issue economics. And moved to Atlanta, my first job, and I was working for, on the side for Jimmy Carter, teaching at Agnes Scott College, but working for Jimmy Carter on the side. And we did an event in 1973, right after the book The Limits to Growth came out.
Mm-hmm.
And Herman Daly, the famous steady state economist, had just published a reader on the steady state economy reader, I think was what it was called, in 72 or 73. And we invited Herman to come down and give a talk to a gathering called the Atlanta Environmental Symposium. And Herman came down and gave a brilliant lecture. He was not a great speaker, but his thought was way ahead of everybody else in the room. He was a brilliant guy.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an introduction to a whole different way of thinking about the economy. It began with thermodynamics, entropy, and the dissipation of materials just by physical processes. And the assembled audience, which included the economists from the region and all the major banks and the Federal Reserve Bank, were there. And they listened politely and applauded politely, and their whatever opposition they had kind of went to ground by virtue of politeness, but that was all there was. And several years later, well, actually back in probably about 2006 or 7, Jimmy Carter and I were having dinner together, and he said, "David, you remember the conference we did on limits to growth?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And he deadpanned that, "Good thing we did it, because if we hadn't done it, Atlanta would have really grown." That was his idea of humor. But my introduction to the subject was how hard it was for Daly to come in and introduce physical science into a discipline that thought it had transcended physical science.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Solow, probably the most famous economist of that era, had an article which he said, natural resources don't matter. We grow the economy without natural resources. We're independent, in other words, of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was my introduction to it. And there's recently a book, Chris Jones, who is an historian of economics out at Arizona State University, just published a book called The History of Infinite Growth.
Hmm.
And it's a description of how hard it was or has been to penetrate into the economics profession. And so, in matters of climate change, William Nordhaus at Yale set the standard for climate science, probably the most famous climate change economist in the world. And his model was we could go to 3 degrees centigrade warming,
Hmm.
what he called his DICE model. I forgot what that stands for, but we could take the planet to 3 degrees centigrade warming. And then because we'd be so much more wealthy at that time or wealthier, we could then divert some of that wealth to dealing with the problems of climate. Um, gross, gross underestimation of physical reality or a total abnegation of physical phenomena. So now we see we're at 1.5. Last year, if I remember correctly, the rise had gone up from about 2 parts per million per year to last year 3.58 or a bit more. You have two different estimates. One had it 3.7 something. So if you're in the cockpit of this airplane, all your control panels are flashing red,
Hmm.
and we have people that were running the economy thought that physical science is kind of a theory. But I'm off on a tangent here. But I think my introduction to economics was kind of the standard intro economics by Wharton.
Hmm.
Both came out. Herman Daly's work began to come out, and people began to question the relationship between the way we earn our keep by the economy and the effects in the natural world.
Yeah. And how do you think, I mean, economics as a discipline has been notoriously hard to change and kind of closed. And as we've seen major changes, they've often come slowly and after lots of debate and resistance. So, it's not too surprising, I guess, that all the economists just didn't wake up and change their minds, I guess, from hearing Herman Daly talk. But why do you think it's been so slow? I mean, 30, 40 years now that we've been talking about these issues and they've, I keep thinking hopefully they're coming out of the shadows, so to speak, and getting more traction. And I think they are in a lot of ways. But, is it, I mean, maybe bring it back to the ecological literacy. Is it just that these people who grew up to be economists aren't getting that basic education and how natural systems works and how our kind of planetary systems work?
Well, good questions. I think it's hard to change any discipline.
Hmm.
I mean, Pope Francis' death highlighted how hard it was for this brilliant man to penetrate some parts of Catholicism.
Yeah.
And we say the same about any religion. I mean, it's just hard to get people to change their minds. The problem with ecological literacy, if I change the term to Earth system science,
Hmm.
maybe a little more acceptable because you get the word science in there. And ecological literacy, in some ways, is misleading. It doesn't mean reading a lot of stuff, but it means reading the nature and so forth. If I was doing that book over again, I'd retitle the book a bit. But I think that what all of us in this represented were a view that was at right angles to the Cartesian worldview and the rational model of disciplinary structure by breaking things into their parts, but not reassembling them. And it's not that you do one or the other, but you have to do both. You have to walk on 2 feet or 2 legs. And so the idea of disciplines was to take the world apart and study parts of it and then
Hmm.
subdisciplines and so forth. Um, the environmental challenge represented a different way of thinking about it. It was a systemic revolution, and you couldn't solve it without dealing with the uh, what Wendell Berry once called the pattern that connects. The idea that you have to study the whole system, and it doesn't mean you don't do individual parts, but you have to do both.
Hmm.
And so, if you're thinking about where does environment fit, one way is well, we have another subject, and we teach environmental stuff. Is a series of subjects and kind of an outshed to the big house that does all the serious stuff, the
Hmm.
disciplines. The more radical way, and this I think all the radical thinkers have been systems thinkers, people like Danella Meadows and people of that sort. You have to begin to rethink the whole structure of learning and how you learn, which means you have to begin to think about neuroscience and what happens in the human mind and how do you bring people into the conversation with the natural world. And it's a major shift from Cartesian thinking that was fragmentary and discipline oriented and reductionist in that way.
Hmm.
And then the idea that somehow nature has rights and animals can think. And the 1840s or thereabouts, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote a essay in Self-Reliance. He wrote that we lie in the lap of great intelligence. And more, as we try to study intelligence in tree roots and animals and birds and so on, we find out that there is a whole lot here we just missed. But that's to see the whole system and the pattern.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's one or the other, but I think we have to, the challenge in education is how do you teach people the skills necessary to master a discipline, but then fit that discipline into a larger context. And sometimes the context will then change what you think about in that little box called a discipline.
Yep. Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, a lot of these conversations we've been having all come back to systems thinking, and I know you've been pioneering that for a long time. And as that shows up in the educational system, we've known each other a long time. You're on Second Nature's board, and Tony Cortese, the founder of Second Nature, has been working on a lot of these issues for a long time. And the examples have been fairly thin in terms of institutions that have really kind of gone full bore into pushing for that, kind of integration across the disciplines. I would say Arizona State, where you're affiliated with now, is one of the best examples of a large institution doing that. But what are your thoughts on, I guess, on that statement and other examples in higher ed that are really trying to take that holistic approach?
well, I think there are a lot of people that are doing and have done really good work for a long time. Tony Cortese and I met in the 1980s. He invited me to come to Tufts, and he was doing faculty seminars trying to introduce this mode of thinking into faculty. And it was a brilliant exercise. I don't know what Tony's final evaluation of that would be, but there are a lot of people doing that kind of thing and asking bigger systemic questions. But in a way, the job market, we fear that, students who graduate with backgrounds of their systems and so forth, that's flaky and fluffy, and they won't be able to find employment. And I think the institutions generally have not always been very imaginative about how they see their curriculum. If you're in a company, you go through your product, you assess your product continually, and the market tells you how well your product accepted and so forth. In the educated world, we take the job market as kind of definitive for what we need to teach.
Hmm.
And a lot of cutbacks, certainly here in Ohio, a lot of the cutbacks have been based on the fact there's no real market for what is being taught, let's say in classics or in various fields of philosophy or in literature. And so we cut those. And computer science is the great thing now, and artificial intelligence and so forth. And I think we're guilty of not seeing ourselves in a larger context. The fact of the matter is humans are very fast thinkers, but we are incredibly slow learners. And we don't, we saw climate change coming. The first warning to a US president was in 1965. Companies began to know by the late 50s that this was going to be a serious global problem.
Hmm.
And yet we still haven't, we still suffer because we have no de jure climate policy in the United States. And globally, we're falling farther and farther behind. So I'm off on a tangent there, but I think that the higher education, and Michael Crow has done a great job as university president and beginning to take a university in that direction and innovating in all kinds of ways. I don't think education generally gets high marks for what they've done. Individual faculty in some departments, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of heroic work out there, a lot of really, really good work, and you know better than I do.
Hmm.
But I think the fundamental process of rethinking how this fits together.
Yeah. Well, back to
Uh,
your point about the disciplines, it's how do we get that interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary thinking
yeah.
going in this older structure. Tell us a little bit about what you are up to at ASU these days, and
Well, there, the last year has upset everybody. I mean,
right.
we're up at the apple cart and trying to still understand what this means.
Hmm.
Not to dwell on it, but I think we're in the face of a authoritarian challenge to the way democracy has worked historically in the United States.
Hmm.
And I think it ought to be taken seriously. We've had warnings. We've seen what the first 100 days has meant and so forth. So what I began to do was to work on democracy and climate issues. Now I think we have to repair democracy before we can get very far on climate policy, and for lots of reasons we can go into later if you'd like. So that's one thing.
Hmm.
And specifically, I'm asking a question. This is myself and a group of people, some in Arizona, some spread around the country. What do we do when the 47th president's term is over? How do we rebuild? And rebuilding can't be just to restore what had been. We've got to do something better.
Right.
When I think about democracy, I think that there are four stages of it in my thinking. One is uh, all the democracies that developed in tribal situations, and then there's Greek democracy, and then there is democracy 3.0, call it, which was Tom Jefferson, the hotel room in Philadelphia, the Constitution, the French Revolution. And that gave us a modern democracy.
Hmm.
That is a very flawed version of what needs to happen. So democracy 4.0 would be we'd redesign a constitution to be more systemic, give nature rights, begin to think of what the left hand and the right hand of government do, and begin to coordinate the way governments actually work. I think you have to give rights to future generations in a way that the writers of the Constitution of the United States didn't anticipate. Posterity is mentioned only in the preamble.
Hmm.
If you're going to think about the rights of future generations and the long shadow that we cast on their rights and their lives, I think we need to do better than that. So I think this democracy 4.0 needs to be on the agenda. And rather than being just against Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans, how can we come together
Hmm.
around issues of an improved democracy? My fear is that so much of what the Trump agenda has been is all about accumulating power with no particular purpose other than just the accumulation of power.
Hmm.
The Doge and Elon Musk's effort have been more of a wrecking ball than an improvement.
Hmm.
And I think that's kind of a standard issue viewpoint of these things
Yeah.
now. So I think that we have to be. So you asked what I'm doing. I'm trying to get my head around this larger issue along with lots of other people of what do we do when this is over?
Yeah. Well, that's
So
exciting because I think so many people are trying to get their head around what's happening right now, and as usual, you're looking forward to what's next. And this isn't something you've been just thinking about in the last 100 days. You wrote Democracy Unchained in 2020, or edited that collection of essays, and then in 2023, Democracy in a Hotter Time. And so, you've been thinking about this intersection of climate and democracy for a long time, kind of seeing this coming. And I think it's fascinating what you said about this democracy 4.0, just like everything else, we're at a full world now in terms of population, in terms of consumption, in terms of growth in a way that I don't think the founding fathers could have really anticipated, in terms of putting as much in the Constitution and those documents to be principle based and ready to change. I think this is such a fundamentally different stage that we're in, that makes a ton of sense, that we need a fundamentally different kind of approach to address those issues you talked about in terms of nature rights and future generations. But I guess, I mean, dive into that because it's refreshing for me to think about that and looking forward instead of the minute to minute, news coming out of the White House and how people are responding and everything. But I guess, this is a sort of a crisis and a turning point, the likes of which we haven't really known in my generation. I mean, maybe World War II and everything had this sort of feel in terms of fundamental shift, but to really redesign that, do you think? Yeah, what are your hopes? Like, how do you see us doing that? Do you think we have the capacity to build something that new in this?
I do think that, and I think that if you're looking for good news on this, I think the good news in a way is that if you get the question right,
Mhm.
big majorities of people are on our side. If you ask MAGA Republicans, do you want to drink dirty water? The answer is no. Do you want to breathe dirty air? No. Do you want climate chaos? No. You go down the line of things that are actually at issue. And we have a large majority of people that want something better. But the bridge that connects what we want and what we get has been rendered into a toll bridge. And so Elon Musk comes in, and for $250 million, he can do his thing. And so far, Trump has gone along with it. But the amount of money spent on elections and the amount of interference in terms of elections and money is beyond my capacity to describe. It's outrageous.
Hmm.
And so democracy, we really don't have democracy. Jimmy Carter said a long time ago that we don't have a democracy, we have a managed oligarchy. And it began with the Citizens United. Well, it didn't begin with Citizens United, but that advanced the whole thing of dark money.
Hmm.
The idea that spending money in elections is a matter of free speech is ridiculous on the face of it. It gives corporate interests a major megaphone and common people that have no particular assets almost no voice at all. So I think that I think a majority, if the questions are right, the majority is with us. And my
Hmm.
frustrating, I think, with the Democratic Party this last election was they didn't raise the issue of climate at all. I mean, it was a great campaign, and Kamala Harris and Tim Walz did heroic work to just get. They had a short runway and they got in the game and so forth. So this is not really a criticism of them, but I would prefer to see a more direct connection between the democratic process and climate change
Hmm.
that is reshuffling the deck here, and it's going to be a horrendous thing. It's not a problem; it's a massive dilemma we face. Um, so I'm probably enough said on that, but I think that if the questions are right, that this does come down to politics, and then the question is, you can't kind of like you say you can't climb the mountain because there's a mountain in front of us.
Right. You got to do it. And you've written about both the need for reform of democratic institutions and for a moral and civic revival. And you kind of alluded, I think, to some of the, campaign finance and some of those issues around democratic institutions. But talk a little bit about what you mean by moral and civic revival and what that might look like in practice.
The best thing I could do is refer for you and whoever is listening eventually to Pope Francis, who
Hmm.
people he's on people's minds now. And in Laudato Si, I think he gave about as good a statement as one could make about the fact that what the problem is with morality. We did an event after Democracy in a Hard Time came out. We did 5 events around the country. One was in Atlanta, and it was kind of poignant because Hurricane Helene was just coming up the coast. It was to hit Atlanta at 8 o'clock the night of our event,
Hmm.
and we had a great crowd. Andy Young gave the opening remarks, John Meacham the closing remarks, but Andy Young called for miracles. And I think beginning to see these things coming together around a different way of relating. But it comes back a lot to money. It comes back to money in politics and simply the corruption of the process.
Yeah.
But at heart, I'm an optimist about this.
Hmm.
And Trump poses huge issues. And you have to say that we may be radically altered by the Trump presidency. And I'm afraid that a good bit of us will be, or a good bit of American politics will be. But it also exposes the weaknesses of the system. If there
Yeah.
is a silver lining in the Trump administration, it is in the fact that he will make things so bad. The overreach we're already seeing in plummeting polls, even after 90 some days. Um, People want something better. I think
Yeah.
it's up to us to begin to give them something better, and it can't be kind of a modified version of the previous system we had. So Democracy 4.0 is a different way of thinking about human engagement, our engagement with the natural world, and also about equity and fairness.
Hmm.
Uh, the economy is skewed. You asked early on about how well we had done. If you take only the issue of equity and fairness and distribution, we're going backwards. And so there was a $50 trillion that moved from the bottom 90% to the top 10%, most of it to the top 1% between 1970 and 2020.
Hmm.
That explains a lot of the Trump vote.
Yeah.
That meant we couldn't afford schools, roads, infrastructure, all the things where we kept saying, oh, we can't afford that, but we could afford tax cuts for the very wealthy.
Right.
This is a matter of economic justice. Now, how that ties in with um, endowment managers is an interesting issue. And I think in the current crisis with the Trump attack on Harvard and universities in general,
Hmm.
this is interesting because I think universities teach in all kinds of ways. We think teaching is confined to classrooms, and part of it is, but it's not confined to classrooms. It's also how the institution behaves in situations like this.
Hmm.
Situations when you talk about divesting from companies that are doing things that you really don't want done in the world, whether it has to do with equity or race or justice or whatever the issues are. But universities can teach in all kinds of ways, and so um, I think Harvard's stand on this will assume that it can be maintained, but Harvard's stand on this is incredibly important. They say last week's statement by 230 or 40
Yeah.
university presidents that signed on the American uh, what was it, AACU
Hmm.
statement. I
Yeah.
mean, those are incredibly important to come together around. But those are ways to teach.
Yeah.
Um,
It was great to see that. And, I think delayed, and it was interesting. I mean, we talked about this late last year as we saw some of this coming and we're wondering what that response would look like. And it took some time, but it's been reassuring in some ways. And, I saw a bunch of former presidents also had their own statement along the same lines that, got right to the heart of the threats to democracy that this administration represents and the importance of higher ed in that. But yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about that because, we've both worked in higher ed for a long time and we've talked a lot about the role modeling aspect of how higher ed operates, how it behaves, and everything it does, including engaging with policy and how it invests in endowment and everything else as learning opportunities and as just good role models. And I guess, what are your thoughts that, we, with the Intentional Endowments Network, we've been focused a lot on the endowment investing piece. And what do you see, as we think about systems and all sort of actors having roles in systems, how investors have a role to play here too? Like how should endowments, institutional investors be either using their voice or their capital um, to, yeah, address these risks we face, both in terms of climate and democracy?
is there an easier question to we could focus on? I think if you're an investor, you have to know a lot, and
Yeah.
it's always I don't have a lot of money, but I have real empathy with people who have a lot of money and figure out how to spend it in the world to do well and do good.
Hmm.
And going back to the early part of the conversation, Herman Daly comes along, and the steady state economists and people like Kate Rayworth in the UK come along and talk about the donut economics and steady state economics and ecological economics and so forth. So, how do you think about the intersection of your pot of money as an endowment manager and the way the world works?
Right.
And the pressure has always been short term. We can't afford to do things that risk our budget because we've got scholarship funds that have to be paid out. We got management funds at the university and salaries and so forth. And so that's a real issue. I don't mean to downplay it at all.
Yeah.
So this is a tough time, and I don't have there's no easy quick answer that I know of.
Hmm.
Somehow, and I think it may be rather like the AACU's statement,
Hmm.
where universities and endowment managers, and you're leading on this, have to come together and agree to some principles so that no one institution is disadvantaged because they begin to shift endowments and it costs them 1.3% of their income or whatever, but the others didn't.
Hmm.
So this is the classic problem of the free to rider that
Yeah.
economists talk about a lot.
Yeah. What do you make of that? Just you kind of alluded to the sort of arms race in some ways in higher ed in terms of facilities and everything else. And people talk about administrative blow, but just the costs that make the endowment return so important to help a lot of these institutions keep going and keep doing the good work that they're doing. What are your thoughts on how we sort of get out of that trap? I mean, it relates back to our whole system again, right? The sort of perpetual growth economic system that higher ed's obviously a part of. But how do you see any ways that they can get out of that loop at least and slow that down?
You promised me that this would be an easier interview. You said all the obvious yes and no
I'm just looking I'm
comments.
just looking for guidance here, David, on what we should be doing.
I think if you're an investment manager, you're sitting in the cockpit, you've got this endowment and so forth.
Yeah.
Then you look over here, and climate change is going to impact us.
Hmm.
in major kind of ways. It's going to cost trillions. There was a study out, I forget where it was, and I should do my homework on this, but it came out the last day or two. Something like climate change is going to impose a cost, something like 100 some trillion dollars. I mean, to quote, fix it, whatever the fix means.
Hmm.
And then you look at the uh, climate refugees. People are going to be moving in the United States. So the National Academy of Science um, studies range from about 13 million Americans now becoming climate refugees to as many as 160 million refugees by the year 2070. Well, 2070 is not that far off.
Hmm.
And that's a pretty wide range, but we're not going to get out. Where do those people go? Uh, at Arizona State University, when last time I was there in the summer last year, temperature was hitting 114. We did a big event on climate democracy there, 114 degrees outside. The water, they're already in the longest drought recorded in the past 1,000 years or some such. So, how do we navigate this, keep an endowment intact, and then on the other side here, democracy and fascism are, nipping at our heels. Um, so you see a whole range of things coming together.
Hmm.
And where do you put money? I wish I had an answer for that. I don't. But I think the smart thing is to do a lot of what you've been doing and Tony did. Let's lead in the transition to a sunshine powered world.
Hmm.
All that pertains thereon too, which means jobs and different kind of technologies and so forth. I mean, that's our best hope is to follow that different path.
Hmm.
But I don't think we'll escape from this without some real costs. And back to Pope Francis for a minute, I think the heart of the problem is we didn't act when we could have acted and head off, going down a highway. We missed a lot of the off ramps to better
Yeah.
destinations than what is directly ahead of us. So, at the heart, this means a matter of caring. And we didn't care enough to act when we could have done it much more cheaply at a much lower human cost. And so here we are in 2025 with 1.5 plus degree warming. That used to be a number that was tossed out. We might hit 1.5 by 2050, and then we'll do as William Nordhaus thought, we'll do a look see, but we don't have to worry until we get to 3 degrees centigrade warming. Then we find out that these systems are much more interactive and reactive
Right.
warming than had been in the model. So we've gotten ourselves out on a kind of a long limb. And if you're an investment manager, um, I think one of the things I suspect, you know much more about this than I do, but I suspect that one of the things we could do is a lot more investment, say 5 or 10 or 20 or 30% in local projects
Hmm.
that are part of our immediate supply chain for food, energy, materials, and so forth. And then the rest of the endowment, uh, I'll leave it to people a lot smarter about these things than I am, but the rest of the endowment, I think you could say we need a lot of it directed at simply human needs,
Hmm.
healthcare, equity issues, housing issues, education issues. And we're not going to make it through the gauntlet we face ahead with a ecologically illiterate public. You can't get to a smart world with dumb people.
Hmm.
And education really is a key to that. We have to have democracy somewhere in the curriculum and earth system science, call it ecological literacy, whatever. These things need to come together. Um, I'm
Yeah.
all, I'm talking around the subject because I don't really know. I don't think there's an easy answer for
Yeah.
you.
No, I mean, there's not clearly, but I think, endowments are unique in that they have that long-term perspective, so they should be thinking about these things and the sort of perpetuity of the institution through these types of big transitions. And, the good news is on a lot of these, there are things that fit into their current, sort of structures in terms of the risk and return profiles they have and the sort of types of vehicles that they can
Yeah.
allocate that they have enough capital to that have, really attractive returns in terms of some of the energy transition opportunities and renewable energy and sustainable agriculture and all sorts of things. So that's what's exciting about our work. But there's also that larger system change that needs to happen. I think a lot of that does come back to the business schools and the economic departments at these institutions too, um, in terms of
Yeah,
how we design new
this
things.
I mentioned. Can you see that? This is
Yep.
Chris Cohen's book, uh, and
The
he raised,
invention of infinite growth. Yeah.
yeah, it's about to come out. This is a pre-publication copy, and I'm not sure what the pub date is, but
Hmm.
um, I think we have to be prepared for the end of growth as we've thought about it or known it.
Hmm.
And I think that was implicit in Herman Daly's thinking. I think that is implicit in Kate Raworth's thinking. And so I think where that takes us is we have to begin to think about these tough political questions of redistribution of income, of prices that tell the truth, in Amory Lovin's phrase, so that we get full cost pricing.
Yep.
And we've known about this for a long time, but it is such a political, third rail of American politics. You don't want to talk about it.
Yep.
I think we need to have a conversation about the limits of what the economy can do and can provide, paying full cost.
Yep.
Gallon of gasoline here in Oberlin is $3.50 or whatever it is today. Uh, the real price should be $25.
Hmm.
And we've known that for a long time.
Yeah.
Um,
We just refuse to send the right price signals, and yeah, it's yeah, it comes back to that economic system. I mean, think back to your point about just being optimistic, though, is in this state of all this disruption and breakdown, that's often what's really necessary to design new systems, right? It's hard to convince everyone to change to a whole new really a new system when the old one's sort of working well enough. And so, maybe this is what it needs. I had an interesting conversation, and you should check out the work of this new group called the Arcata Institute. A gentleman named Matt Orsaw, who was with the CFA Institute for many years, and some colleagues just started it, and it's taking all of these conversations or work around ecological economics and post growth economics, and just really elevating that conversation. Um, and so he was making this point on a recent episode that, you know, even if it wasn't Trump, or even if it wasn't these exact same circumstances, that just because of the unsustainability that we've known has been growing, that there's going to be a break in the systems in some way, shape, or form around this time. And this is just sort of happens to be how it's manifesting. But it does kind of open up that opportunity, and hopefully, and thanks to people like you and others who have been doing this work for so long, we've got a lot of tools to work with in how we think about designing the next system.
it's also if this is an emotional test, isn't it? Because one way to see this is, oh my God, things are going to hell, and I'm not feeling very well today, and stock markets collapse and all that. The other way to think about it is, my God, what an incredibly exciting time.
Hmm.
You have to rethink a whole lot of things, including how they fit together into a coherent systemic pattern.
Yeah.
And so, this is our graduation moment,
Hmm.
and to be kind of maudlin and quote Winston Churchill, which is kind of fun to do sometimes. But Churchill referred to, if 500 years now, we want people to look back and say this was their finest hour. Well, we're at that point in human history.
Yeah.
And you can't, there's no plausible way, I think, that you can run the film fast forward and see a happy outcome. There are too many things coming at us. We're not prepared for this. And they're global, and they're not temporary. Once you heat the atmosphere, it takes a long time for the atmosphere to come back into any kind of stable order. Once you drive species into extinction, they're gone. But what an incredible time for human ingenuity.
Yeah.
And you see it in bits and pieces all around. I think part of our challenge is to link these together.
Hmm.
But ultimately, I think, from my perspective, we have to think politically. We
Hmm.
have got to get involved in uh, politics is about who gets what, when, and how. That's kind of the standard definition of. Well, environment needs to be in there. Air is one of those things you get. Climate stability is one of those things you get. Soils. So, uh, environment is part of that, the heart of that chain of who gets what, when, and how. So eventually, all of this needs to be resolved in some kind of political fashion. And so one of the events we did last year, after the book came out, was an event in New York on constitutional law, the climate and constitution and democracy. And it was aimed at law students in the New York area. And Jimmy May and Katie Koo, that did the hard work on the event, pulled off a great event. But the morale and the excitement around that event was pretty incredible.
Hmm.
But to begin to rethink these things, not as, oh my God, kind of problems, but as opportunities to build back something better. I call that democracy 4.0, but that's just tagline on what's a very complicated process and outcome.
Hmm. Yeah, it is exciting. I mean, there's been no opportunity like this in the history of human existence, really, and we've never, yeah, never
Uh,
had this many people looking at this many issues on one planet. But no, I think it really is exciting, and I know we're not going to go down this whole other rabbit hole, but you were also early and one of the first people I read talking about AI and how that interacts with all of this, and obviously it can help and it can hurt on the climate front, but also it is opening up new conversations when you think about jobs and just the idea of universal basic incomes or just some of that, again, coming back to the fairness piece, it's just such a big disruption that people are, more people are talking about these ideas, taking them seriously, I think. And
you know, on that subject, about a half a century ago, uh, we did an event on technology and the human future. We had people like Paul Hawken and Amory Lovins and Danella Meadows and so forth, quite a crowd of good people. And one of the people we had at the event was Joe Weizenbaum. And Joe Weizenbaum was a computer scientist at MIT,
okay.
refugee from Nazi Germany, wrote a book called Computer Power and Human Reason in 1976. And he did the first chat GPT program. So he came down. We had our place. We had a conference center. So he came down to the place. We had about 40 college students there, and probably 45 or 50 other people there.
Hmm.
And he sat there. He stayed with us for a week, and he talked about AI. His first Chat GPT program, which he called Liza, and his argument was take the whole thing together and compress it into two words. Don't do it. He said we can't control it.
Hmm.
Greener, the great mathematician at MIT back in the late 40s, said much the same thing. And I'm going to bollocks up the quote, but it was effect when at some point, the more freedom we grant them, these systems, at
Yeah.
some point they'll arrive at sentience. And then he said, when they do, we have no good reason to believe they'll be kindly disposed to us. We've had warnings. Even Elon Musk described AI once as summoning the devil, quote
Hmm.
unquote. And so here we have these systems that will be, you and I have stubbed toes and broken hearts and looked at the stars, and we're made of flesh. These systems are made of silicon, and so they'll have none of our emotional experiences. They will have a cold, calculating intelligence. Our bet is that we can control them. And if you and I were to decide to go into organized crime, uh, we're in the academy, we're in disorganized crime, maybe some people put it, but you want to have AI on your side. You want to ask the question to your systems: How can I, steal the most money as the least possible risk? And these things are entirely neutral. The
Hmm.
fear I have is that this number, usually tossed out, that we 1,000 times smarter than we are. Maybe it's 500, maybe it's 5,000. Who knows? But a good bit smarter than we are. When they would reprogram themselves, if and when, and I think it's more likely when, we'd have no way to know about it. They wouldn't tell us. We would see it only in the rearview mirror. And so we're dealing with something for which we have no rules, no regulations. And to have those, you would have to have international regulations.
Hmm.
Have to have a pretty good police force, because organized crime and non-state actors and even a lot of states would try to cheat on this and acquire this great intelligence system. So you end up, if you're asking, my wife's had a bout of cancer the last couple of years, and AI applied to issues like healthcare and cancer, incredibly powerful. I mean, they
Hmm.
can do in a matter of minutes or hours what a team of scientists couldn't do in 10, decade. Uh, that would be good. On the other side, if you say, what do we do with battlefield robots,
Yeah.
artificially intelligent battlefield robots, and what happens when those take on human characteristics and go rogue in society? And if people say, well, it's a great technology, it's a great advance, but there's a downside to it. Well, the downside is probably civilizational collapse. That's not my opinion. That's the opinion of people who study this thing and say, wait, we're depending on the roll of the dice here.
Hmm.
And if it comes up, so who has the right to
Yeah.
It's kind of like at Alamogordo when there was one chance in whatever it was that setting off an atomic explosion would ignite the atmosphere, and
Hmm.
nobody knew what it was. It was they knew it was a small risk of one in a million or 500,000 or whatever it was. I've forgotten the number. But who has those kind of rights?
Yeah, to make that decision.
And we stumbled into this without guardrails, without a philosophy. And the other day in the New York Times, there was an article last week on when we deploy these systems, uh, do they have rights like you and I have right of free speech and so forth? Does
Hmm.
a robot have that? Well, there's a
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
You
We've already
know,
given them to corporations, but not nature. So we'll see if money has anything to do with it. They probably will. But
Joe Weizenbaum's book on it is still in print and it still reads well.
really,
1976.
wow, wow.
And his answer to all this was just don't do it.
Just shut it down. Yeah.
There-
Well, I'm afraid the train's out of the station on it, and just another existential crisis to think about, I guess. But it's actually an area we'll be working on this year, to where I think investors actually do have a pretty direct role in say in terms of their allocations to venture capital funds and how venture capital funds are working with and guiding the companies they're investing in at an early stage and what types of guardrails they can put on and responsible tech
it's
policies they can.
it is a devilish problem because if one country puts on restrictions and imposes guardrails and say China doesn't or vice versa, then the
Yeah,
whole thing breaks down. So we have to have this is one of those cases where some kind of global agreement would eventually be essential.
absolutely. Well, we'll
Uh,
see. We'll see.
so when you have your time work on that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, David, this has been great. We've covered a lot of big topics. I wanna run through a couple quick ones for our audience from you. And you've recommended actually a lot of resources that we'll put on the show notes for this because I think we ran through some of them pretty quickly, but there are some really foundational pieces in the canon of sustainability that you mentioned. But what's one kind of book, podcast, resource that you're really enjoying or finding useful right now that you might recommend to people to check out if they were going to just pick one?
The I just finished writing an article that'll be actually in a book that Michael Crow is co-editing from Arizona State.
Uh-huh.
It's called Fast Thinkers and Slow Learners.
Hmm.
And it got me in a whole series of things. It's a fairly longish article. But one of the really interesting things is this whole field of intelligence and animal intelligence.
Hmm.
And it takes me back to that quote I mentioned by Ralph Waldo Emerson. We lie in a lap of great intelligence. And sort
Hmm.
of looked into intelligence of natural systems and the way systems are constructed, the more we see something for which we really don't have a word. Intelligence implies a neuro system, brain and neurosystem. And these systems don't have that. And yet the outcomes, Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist, has a quote, and I'll bollocks this, but he said, even basic minerals at the very start of the evolution of life were doing things the right way,
Hmm.
but they have no brain. There's no known way that there's anything like intelligence, but we see the outcome
Yeah.
as representing something that looks a lot like intelligence.
Hmm.
But I find that incredibly interesting. And it spans fields of biology, ecology, neuroscience, animal behavior. I mean, it spans everything.
Yeah.
I think
It
we're
is it is fascinating, and it's in like so many of these areas, coming back, it comes back to a lot of indigenous knowledge and indigenous wisdom and indigenous cultures that
yes,
saw and understood this kind of thing and had words for this. And the same for systems thinking and a lot of the work we've done. I think it's always important to kind of point back to that we're sort of trying to recreate in this quote unquote modern civilized world what lots of people have known for a long time.
yeah, it's a that's one of the things I've found in the last few months or the last year or so.
Hmm.
Incredibly exciting. There's so much good work being done in that field. Ed Yost, who writes for Atlantic, uh, is one of the leaders in the field, but there are several dozen people that are producing incredible kinds of stuff that's really interesting, combining natural history and
Yeah.
systems and all this kind of stuff.
Nice. All right. So fast learners, fast thinkers, slow learners. That's
I
the
will
article.
send you a copy of this paper. It's finished, I think, for the most part, but it's one of those papers that will never really be finished. There are
Right.
always more things
Got
to
it.
add.
Good, good. All right. How about outside of work when you're not wrestling with all these big topics and ideas? What are you up to for fun these days?
Well, the normal answer is I love to travel. I used to, when I had good knees, I played basketball and tennis and things like that. And I'm to the point where I have to watch those things more often than play them.
Hmm.
But I'm writing a book right now on the 1980s. And I'm about finished with it. But I think some of the cracks that we see widening in American society were evident in the 1980s. So it's a book about things that were evident, I think, in the 1980s as we
Yeah.
passed a lot of off ramps. We passed a lot of good things we could have done better.
Yeah. Interesting.
Uh,
I
kind
wonder,
of,
do you touch back to, I always love the data that shows around the 1970s was the point where our economic growth and our happiness diverged, where the economic growth kept going up, but the happiness and fulfillment didn't quite so much. Do you find that feeding into the 80s signals in your work on that?
yeah, the first study on that, I think that I recall, well, no, it couldn't be the first study because this goes back into philosophy, but Richard Esterlin, an economist, was studying growth rates and wealth and happiness.
Hmm.
And he found out at the start, more wealth makes you happier. And
Right.
then you hit a plateau and then it begins to decline. He went back and replicated the study, and I forgot, maybe 10 years ago, maybe. And the same is true. And, this stuff doesn't make us happy. So every 5-year-old knows that. Anybody that thinks about their life knows that, hey, it was the fact I play tennis or go to a poker game or we have a poetry league here or going down to the pub and talking to people. It's
Yeah.
always kind of convivial settings where you're with people.
Yeah.
Uh, and so Esterlin just put numbers to it.
Right.
And after you take care of some basic level of need, it's all kind of irrelevant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Elon Musk is down on one side of this. He's on the downside, and you laugh at that, but we have a language that rewards growth. We
Yeah.
assume growth is
Hmm.
just a good thing. And I noticed in my students that in my over the course of my teaching career, students began to confuse selfishness with self-interest. You
Hmm.
can't help but be self-interested, but you have a choice about being selfish. But they would conflate the two and
Mm.
just assuming that, well, everybody's selfish because we're all self-interested and selfish. No, it's not true. And I think the part of the interesting work ahead is to begin to rethink the economics of happiness. And there's a sizable literature already there.
Right.
But the things that make us happy are things that bring us together.
Yeah.
Things that generally make us miserable and neurotic and do terrible things are things that drive us apart.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
It's all relationships and community. And yeah, no,
think about that because the velocity of accumulation is fast.
mhm.
The velocity of relationship is slow.
Right.
There's no fast way to be a good parent.
Hmm.
No fast way to be a good friend. And there's no fast way to enjoy a convivial evening. I mean, you're not sitting there looking at your clock or your watch and saying, okay, we got to go.
Are we having fun yet? Yeah.
So there's a clock speed to happiness that is contrary to the clock speed of the economy as we experience it or think it ought to be.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, speaking of happiness and some of these big, heavy issues we've talked about, we know that these can really drive a lot of anxiety and in some cases really kind of serious mental health issues as people look at
Mm-hmm.
some of these existential crises. And you mentioned a little bit about the opportunity side of this. That can be really exciting too. But what advice would you give to people that are kind of caught in that doom cycle and thinking about these things to take care of themselves?
Go for a walk in the woods.
Hmm.
Do something for a friend. Find somebody that needs help. There's nothing like helping people to make life take on a whole different cast, I think.
Hmm.
And in a way, George, this involves a change. The pronouns of the growth economy are my, I, me, and mine. Of the convivial economy, if there's such a thing, it's we, ours, and us.
Hmm.
And the us, it includes posterity, it includes your pet dog, the birds in your yard. I mean, it's a big thing. And the trick of it, it's so ironic because we tend to think you take care of number one by taking care of number one.
Hmm.
And the fact is, the old Buddhist adage that you take care of, I am because you are. Uh, there's this irony in this. And I think stepping back from these issues of sustainability, it seems to me, when we arrive at a condition of sustainability, conviviality, peace, security, so we get to that nirvana,
Hmm.
I our descendants will look back and say it was just so obvious all along.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the things we thought on this side of the challenge, oh God, we can't do that. We can't afford to take a 3% cut here or have less money here or have less growth. God, we can't do those things. On the other side, when we've done them, we'll look back, if that's a convivial society, and it would be,
Hmm.
back as a good God, well, these people missed it. That's just so obvious.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a math pathology that we're working through in a lot of
Yeah,
ways. Yeah.
it is. And I think the when people say, I've never bought into the view that humans are basically nasty.
Hmm.
Maria Menachal wrote a book, I think that's her name, wrote a book called The Ornament of the World. And it's how Muslims and Christians lived together in Spain before the Christian right wingers. This goes back to what, 700 year or what year it was.
Hmm.
It's a brilliant book. It shows how you can come together, different religions, but you can come together. And if there's a world ever needed that message, it's now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've got two final questions, David. I asked all my guests, so I'm going to ask them to you. Um, this one's a big picture one, which we've already covered a lot of, but what is your vision as you think about these topics of the future of finance in this context? What does finance need to do to get us through to that desired future we're working towards?
Do I have an option? Second question.
Pass.
People I know involved in and around finance, and you're certainly a good example of this, are good people trying to do, by and large, well, good things in the world.
Hmm.
Their tool is money. And I think that the use of money to do good things is a brilliant calling. And I think that that's separate from the growth economy. I think that we need to make a distinction between the economic realities of an economy in an ecosystem. Um, but I don't think I have any good advice except be bold, loving, caring, work out of the system, be
Hmm.
innovative. You're certainly part of this, and do things with money that we haven't done before.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
And I would say what you've been talking about this whole conversation really is just looking at these alternative theories of how economies could work and how we get
yeah,
past this growth mentality and still, meet more human needs, make people happier, do create the kind of well-being that we think we're chasing right now, right?
right, right. That's a good way to put it.
Hmm. And so you've worked with students in higher ed for a long time, and that's another way we think about the future of finance is the people that are going to be going into this field or working with money or these ideas. So you've already given them a lot of advice in terms of resources, books they should read, great thinkers over the past 30, 40 years that they should be familiar with. But yeah, anything else you'd add to a current college student thinking about a career in finance right now?
you know, uh, you keep asking. Yeah, you promised me you'd ask easy questions for young people. Um, I don't give advice much. I try not to.
Hmm.
Sometimes I break down and give advice, but it's always kind of stupid and irrelevant. I think the idea is to have a life first
Hmm.
and then a career, but know kind of who you are, what you want to do in the world, what your values are, and then find your career later. I mean, the cart and the horse have a certain relationship. Get them in the right relationship. But the first thing to do is have a life and
Hmm.
and and get your values straightened out, and then find a career. I don't think if you turn that around and start with a career interest first and career planning and get a great career, pays a lot, and you're having, and then go find a life then. I don't think it works as well that way.
Hmm.
And so Mary Oliver, the poet, in her great line puts it, what will you do with your one wild, precious life?
Hmm.
And we tend to think of that as conflated to career advice or career counseling. And I always thought that was kind of, if you got 1 second, I'll tell you one story.
Please.
I had a student who was an advisee of mine who wanted to be, first day of, came to Oberlin, he wanted to be a doctor. And every time I meet him, we'd go over his career and his course, and so he's a terrible student. He got a C in organic chemistry. He disqualified himself for every medical school, for the prince. And so his parents came in when he was a senior. His parents came in the office, and they were dressed in the nines. One was an oncologist in New York. The other worked as a cancer researcher at Rockefeller University. And they were really disappointed. Vinny had not lived up to expectations, and he still professed to want to be a doctor. His parents thankfully left my office. And I said, Vinny, let's go uptown and have a cup of coffee. So we walked uptown. I said, Vinny, what do you want to be? Well, I want to be a doctor. I said, bullshit, you don't want to be a doctor. Look your grade. He said, well, you really want to know? He said, yeah, tell me. He says, I have always been fascinated by wolves. Well, it happened to be that particular time, I had a friend who had a wolf project going on up in Montana, tracking wolves going across the Canadian border. And so Vinny went up there and spent the summer up there, and he's now a wildlife biologist, specialist in wolves.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
So you find these things. The kids don't try to be what your parents think you ought to be. Be what you know in your heart you want to be.
Mm-hmm.
Let's find your life, get a life, and then your career will fall in place.
Mm-hmm.
So
Perfect. Well, I love it. Well, David, thank you again for all your time and for all your work over the years. You've been such a inspiration and just, guide for me.
Thank you for doing what you do with intentional endowments and the good work you do. You're an amazing person.
Well, thank you. We're all working together, right? And hopefully we'll get there. And hopefully
Yeah.
more people tap into these ideas and share their thoughts. So really appreciate you sharing all these great insights and work on this podcast. And always great to catch up. We'll be in touch and hopefully we'll get through this.
Oh, we're going to get through it. George, thanks for your work and thanks for the opportunity to talk a bit.
You bet. All right. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks for tuning in for the Future of Finance podcast. We hope you found today's conversation insightful and inspiring. Don't forget to subscribe or follow us on your favorite podcast platform. And please take a moment to rate, review, or share the show. All of this really helps us to reach more people like you who care about creating a thriving and sustainable future. And it's a really easy way to have a big impact. So please do follow. A quick disclaimer, the content of this podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice. Investments and strategies discussed may not be suitable for all listeners. Please consult a financial, legal, tax, or accounting professional before making any investment decisions. References to managers and funds are for informational purposes only and should not be considered endorsements or investment solicitations. This podcast does not monitor fund performance or guarantee the accuracy of third-party materials or statements. This has been an episode of the Future of Finance podcast, exploring how finance can shape a vibrant and sustainable future. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.